Commander Vecthar stood before the Galactic Council chamber with his forearms clasped behind his back and his scarred face showing the weight of 3 centuries of war. He had seen empires rise and fall and had fought battles across 100 worlds, but nothing prepared him for what he needed to tell these politicians today. The chamber was massive, with representatives from 40 different species sitting in a circle around him, and each one looked at him with varying degrees of interest and boredom. High Chancellor Morduin sat at the center position with his translucent skin glowing softly in the chamber lights, and he gestured for Vecthar to begin speaking. The old commander activated his datapad, and a holographic image of a blue and green planet appeared above the chamber floor, rotating slowly and showing continents and oceans. This was Earth, and it looked peaceful from space, but Vecthar knew better than to judge anything by its appearance. He had learned that lesson the hard way 3 months ago, when his reconnaissance fleet encountered a human vessel near the edge of explored space. What should have been a simple first contact situation turned into something that still gave him nightmares. Vecthar began his report by explaining how his battlecruiser had detected a small human exploration ship in neutral territory and how he had approached with standard diplomatic protocols. The human vessel was primitive by galactic standards, with barely functioning weapons and outdated shields that would not stop a single shot from his cruiser. He had thought it would be a routine encounter where he would catalog a new species and move on, but then pirates attacked both ships. The pirates were Vraxian raiders with a stolen military frigate, and they saw easy prey in the damaged human ship and his cruiser that was not expecting combat. What happened next made the council members lean forward in their seats. Vector explained how the human crew, consisting of only 12 individuals, made a decision that defied all military logic. Instead of fleeing or asking for help, they boarded the pirate vessel. Counselor Threnix from the Karthos Empire laughed and said that was suicide, not strategy, but Vecthar shook his head and continued his story. He showed footage from his ship's sensors of those 12 humans moving through the pirate vessel like a force of nature. They fought 47 pirates with a combination of tactics and raw aggression that he had never witnessed in his long career. The footage showed a human male named Jake Murphy taking a plasma shot to his shoulder that should have taken him out of the fight, but instead he ripped off the damaged armor plate and kept fighting with one hand while biting down on a medical strip to bind his wound. Another human named Lisa Grant provided covering fire with such accuracy that she never wasted a single shot, and her eyes showed no fear at all, just cold calculation. The council watched in silence as the humans cleared corridor after corridor and left dead pirates in their wake. When Jake faced the pirate captain in hand-to-hand combat, the Vraxian was twice his size and armed with a plasma axe that could cut through starship hulls. But Jake killed him with nothing but a knife and determination. Vecthar paused the footage and looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. He told them that this was not the most disturbing part of his report, and several council members exchanged confused glances. The commander explained that after the battle, when he offered medical assistance to the wounded humans, Jake had smiled at him with blood still running down his armor and thanked him for the help. The young human had expressed hope that they would meet again as friends, and there was no bravado in his voice, just genuine warmth, despite having nearly died minutes before. The old warrior went on to explain what he learned about humans after that encounter. He had spent weeks researching their species, and what he found terrified him more than any enemy he had faced. Humans evolved on what galactic standards would classify as a death world, with extreme weather patterns and dangerous predators and gravity that was 20% higher than standard. They developed as persistence hunters who could chase prey for days until it collapsed from exhaustion, and their entire evolutionary history was defined by competition and conflict. While other species developed civilization through cooperation and trade, humans spent 10,000 years fighting each other and perfecting the art of warfare. Vecthar pulled up more data showing human conflicts, and the numbers were staggering. They had fought thousands of wars among themselves with weapons that ranged from sharpened stones to nuclear bombs capable of destroying cities. Their literature, celebrated warriors and their heroes, were almost always soldiers or fighters. Even their entertainment focused heavily on conflict and combat. The commander explained that humans possessed something called adrenaline that made them stronger and faster when threatened, and they had redundant organ systems that let them survive injuries that would kill most species. Their pain tolerance was abnormally high, and their healing factor was remarkable for a species of their technological level. High Chancellor Morduin raised a tentacle and asked why any of this mattered. When the Dominion had weapons that could destroy planets and a fleet of 10,000 warships, Vecthar looked at the Chancellor with tired eyes and explained that technology alone did not win wars. He said that humans would fight with whatever they had, and they would never surrender as long as they could still draw breath. The commander told the council that humanity needed to be approached with respect and offered friendship, not conquest, because making them an enemy would be the worst mistake the Dominion could make. Councillor Thrennick stood up, and his massive frame cast a shadow across the chamber floor. He said that Vecthar was being paranoid, and that one primitive species could not threaten an empire that spanned 3,000 systems. Other council members nodded in agreement, and Vecthar felt his heart sink because he knew they would not listen. He tried one more time and urged them to at least send a diplomatic envoy to Earth and establish peaceful relations before anyone did something that could not be undone. The humans valued honor and loyalty above all else, and they would make fierce allies if treated with dignity. The vote was called, and Vecthar watched as species after species voted against his proposal. They did not see the danger, and they believed their technological superiority made them invincible. Only 3 species voted with him, and the rest either voted no or abstained. High Chancellor Morduin thanked him for his service and dismissed him from the chamber. As Vecthar walked through the crystal corridors of the station, he felt the same dread he had felt before the Plasma Wars, when politicians ignored warnings until it was too late. In his quarters that night, Vecthar looked at the final piece of footage he had not shown the council. It was Jake Murphy standing over the body of the pirate captain, covered in blood and injuries, but still standing. The young human had looked directly at the camera and smiled, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Vecthar sent a message to his student, who commanded a listening post near human space, telling him to monitor everything and record all data about humans because war was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. 6 months passed since Vecthar stood before the council and gave his warning about humanity. But nobody listened to him, and now the consequences were about to unfold. Fleet Admiral Krondar commanded the Dominion expansion fleet from his flagship as they entered a star system that humans called Alpha Centauri. The system had been marked for Dominion expansion, and the survey teams reported only a small mining colony on the 3rd planet with about 2,000 inhabitants. Krondar was a Hellion, and his species preferred diplomatic solutions to problems, so he ordered his crew to open communications with the colony. Instead of just forcing them out, the view screen flickered to life and showed a human woman in a gray uniform with short brown hair and calm green eyes. Her name was Kate Morrison, and she identified herself as the director of the Alpha Centauri Colonial Authority. Krondar was surprised when she said she had been expecting them because most primitive species did not track Dominion fleet movements. Kate explained that humans had been watching the Dominion's expansion patterns for 8 months, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the fleets reached their colonies. Krondar kept his tone friendly and explained that the Alpha Centauri system fell within Dominion expansion zones according to their laws, and that the human colonists would need to relocate. He offered generous compensation and promised that the relocation would be handled with care and respect. Kate listened to everything he said without changing her expression, and then she told him something that made his bio luminescent markings flicker with concern. She said that humans did not recognize Dominion authority over their colonies, and that the people living in Alpha Centauri had built homes and started families, and they were not leaving. The Admiral tried to reason with her and pointed out that the Dominion had 40 warships in his fleet, while the human colony had no military defenses beyond basic shields. Kate smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile, and she asked him a simple question about how many soldiers he actually had. Krondar said he had enough, and Kate replied that they would see about that. She gave him 24 hours to withdraw from the system and said that after the deadline passed, they would consider his presence an act of war. The transmission ended before Krondar could respond. His tactical officer, who was a Karthos warrior named Thulvin started laughing and said the humans were clearly bluffing because they had no weapons and no way to fight back. Krondar was not so sure, and he remembered reading a report from Commander Vekthar about human combat capabilities. He pulled up the file and read it again, and his markings dimmed with worry. The Admiral ordered his crew to prepare a full combat deployment with 2,000 soldiers, even though his officers said that was excessive. For a colony of civilians, 23 hours later, when the deadline was almost over, the human colony transmitted another message. This time, a man appeared on the view screen wearing combat fatigues and carrying a rifle. He was in his 40s with gray hair and scars on his weathered face, and his name tag said Colonel Danny Ward. The colonel looked directly at Krondar and said that Director Morrison had given them a deadline and a warning, but they chose to ignore both, and that was a mistake. Krondar tried to reason with him and said that the Dominion had 2,000 trained soldiers ready to deploy, and that the humans could not win this fight. Danny smiled, and it was the kind of smile that came from someone who had heard those words many times before. He told Krondar that he had fought in 6 different wars on Earth, had been shot 7 times and stabbed twice and blown up more than he cared to remember. The colonel explained that every person in the colony knew how to fight, and they had turned the mining tunnels into a fortress with traps and ambush points in every corridor. He said that Krondar would not be fighting soldiers, but miners who knew every centimeter of the colony, and engineers who could turn their equipment into weapons, and parents who would die before letting anyone take their children's future away. The transmission ended, and Thulvin was still laughing and calling it primitive bravado. Krondar wanted to call off the assault because every instinct he had developed over decades of service was screaming at him to withdraw, but the Council's orders were clear. The expansion could not be delayed by one primitive colony, so he gave the order to deploy the assault force. 2,000 Dominion soldiers loaded into transport ships and descended toward the colony as the sun rose over Alpha Centauri 3. The first transport landed in the central plaza of the mining colony, and 50 soldiers disembarked. In perfect formation, with weapons ready, the plaza looked empty and abandoned with no signs of life anywhere. The soldiers advanced toward the main colony building following standard tactical procedures. That was when the plaza exploded beneath their feet. The humans had rigged mining charges under the landing pad and shaped them to direct the blast upward. The first wave of soldiers was torn apart in seconds, and the survivors scrambled for cover as explosions continued around them. From the surrounding buildings, colonists opened fire with modified mining lasers that could cut through solid rock, and they burned through Dominion armor like it was paper. A man named Ryan Blake led a group of 15 miners from a fortified warehouse overlooking the plaza. Ryan had served 10 years in Earth's military before retiring to mine asteroids, and he used every bit of that training now. He waited until 30 more Dominion soldiers grouped together to secure the landing zone, and then he gave the order to fire. His team's coordinated attack cut down half the soldiers before they could find cover. More transports tried to land, but the humans had prepared for that too. Mining tunnels allowed them to move beneath the colony unseen, and they popped up behind Dominion formations to attack from unexpected angles. Every route was trapped, and every corridor was a killing zone. A mining engineer named Sophie Grant used her demolition expertise to collapse tunnels on advancing soldiers, and she had spent 15 years learning how to move rock efficiently. Now she used those same skills to bury enemy troops under tons of stone and metal. Krondar watched the tactical displays from orbit and saw his forces being cut apart by what should have been helpless civilians. He had expected to overwhelm them with superior numbers and technology, but the humans fought with a ferocity that his soldiers were not prepared for. When a Dominion soldier wounded a human defender, that person did not retreat or surrender. Instead, they became more dangerous and fought harder. Kate Morrison directed the defense from the Colony Command Center, and her calm voice guided defenders through the chaos like she was managing a mining operation instead of a battle. By nightfall, Krondar had lost 400 soldiers and had not secured a single strategic objective. His forces were scattered and demoralized and running low on supplies. Thulvin urged him to use orbital strikes and level the colony from space, but Krondar refused. He said that the Council's orders were not worth the lives this was costing, and that these humans were not going to surrender, no matter how many soldiers he sent. The Admiral ordered a full withdrawal in all forces, returned to their ships. As the Dominion fleet left the Alpha Centauri system, Krondar sent 2 messages. The first went to the Council reporting the situation and recommending immediate diplomatic negotiations with Earth. The second message went to Commander Vecthar, and it contained only 3 words that said, "You were right." In the colony below, the humans watched the ships disappear into the darkness of space. Danny Ward stood beside Kate Morrison, and both of them were exhausted but alive. Around them, colonists began treating the wounded and counting their losses. Kate asked if Donnie thought the Dominion would come back, and the colonel nodded slowly. He said that eventually they would return, but maybe next time they would talk first instead of threatening. Danny looked up at the stars where the alien fleet had vanished and said that if the Dominion came back with everything they had, then humans would be ready. The colonists had proven something important today, and they showed the galaxy that humanity would not be pushed around by anyone, no matter how powerful they claimed to be. The news of what happened at Alpha Centauri spread through the Dominion like wildfire, and for the first time in 3 centuries, a primitive species had forced a Dominion fleet to retreat without achieving their objectives. High Chancellor Morduin called an emergency council session, and the chamber filled with representatives arguing loudly about what should be done. Councillor Threnix was furious and demanded that the Dominion send their entire battle fleet to crush the humans and show the galaxy what happened when anyone defied their authority. Commander Vecthar stood once more before the council and reminded them that this was exactly what he had warned them about months ago when nobody wanted to listen. Vecthar explained that the problem was not about numbers or weapons, but about the fundamental difference in how humans and the Dominion approached conflict. He said that the Dominion sent soldiers to fight wars, but humans sent everyone because when their homes were belittled, threatened, every civilian became a warrior. Threnix shouted that next time they would send 20,000 soldiers instead of 2,000, and if that was not enough, they would send 200,000. The old commander shook his head and said that humans would fight with everything they had every single time, and that the Dominion needed to understand this was not about winning battles, but about whether they could afford the cost of victory. The council voted again, and this time 28 species voted for military escalation, while only 10 voted for diplomatic solutions. High Chancellor Morduin announced that they would send a diplomatic envoy to Earth to demand compensation for their losses and recognition of Dominion authority over disputed space. He said that if the humans refused, then the Dominion would respond with overwhelming force. Vecta left the chamber knowing that war was now inevitable, because the council still did not understand what they were dealing with, and their pride would not allow them to back down. On Earth, in the headquarters of the United Earth Defense Force, the mood was tense but determined. President Ellen Torres sat at a conference table surrounded by military advisors and diplomatic staff. General Marcus Hill, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, presented intelligence reports showing that the Dominion had approximately 10,000 warships with technology centuries ahead of human capabilities. President Torres asked the simple question of whether they could win, and Marcus met her eyes and said not in a conventional war, because the Dominion could destroy Earth's cities from orbit before humans could mount an effective defense. The general explained that humanity had 3 advantages that might let them survive. First, they had been preparing for this possibility since detecting the Dominion's expansion patterns, and they had militarized the asteroid belt and hidden weapons platforms throughout the solar system and trained every able-bodied person in basic combat skills. Second, they had the home field advantage because the Dominion was fighting across light years of space with extended supply lines. While humans were defending their home where every person knew what was at stake, Third and most important, humanity was willing to pay a price that the Dominion could not imagine because they had been at peace for generations while humans had never stopped preparing for war. Secretary of State Greg Palmer suggested that they should at least listen to what the Dominion diplomatic envoy had to say. President Torres agreed and said they would hear the Dominion's demands, but they would not give up Alpha Centauri, and they would not bow to alien authority because humanity did not kneel to anyone. 3 weeks later, the Dominion envoy arrived at Earth, and the delegation was led by Ambassador Felinora, who was a Helion diplomat known for her negotiation skills. She was received at the New Geneva, a diplomatic facility where President Torres greeted her personally, along with General Hill and Secretary Palmer. The negotiations began in a conference room with a view of the Atlantic Ocean. Ambassador Felinora explained that the Dominion required compensation for the 400 soldiers killed at Alpha Centauri in recognition of their authority over disputed space and assurances that humans would not interfere with future expansion. President Torres listened patiently and then responded that, from the human perspective, the Dominion had invaded a legally established colony and attempted to forcibly remove their citizens. She said that humans were prepared to discuss peaceful coexistence and trade agreements and mutual recognition of territory, but they would not pay compensation for defending their homes, and they would not recognize Dominion authority over human space. Felinora's bioluminescent markings flickered with frustration, and she said that President Torres needed to understand the reality of the situation. The Dominion spanned 3,000 systems and had technology and resources beyond human imagination, and this was not a negotiation between equals. General Hill interrupted and asked why they were negotiating at all if the Dominion was so superior, and why not just attack. The room fell silent, and Felinora looked at Hill carefully before saying that despite their technological advantage, the Dominion valued life, and they were not conquerors but builders of civilization. President Torres said that humans were builders too, and they had been creating civilization on Earth for 10,000 years through wars and peace and technological advancement and spreading to the stars. She said that they were not primitives waiting to be guided by some benevolent empire, but an independent species, claiming their rightful place in the galaxy. The negotiations continued for 3 days with both sides, presenting proposals and counter-proposals, but the fundamental disagreement remained unchanged. The Dominion demanded submission, and humanity refused to give it. On the final day, Ambassador Felinora made one last appeal and said that she had studied human history and culture since arriving, and she understood that they saw this as a matter of principle. She warned that principles would not protect their people when the battle fleet arrived. Torres looked out at the ocean and watched waves crash against the shore before telling Felinora a story about how 300 years ago a small group of humans had declared independence from the most powerful empire of their time. Those humans were outgunned and outnumbered and outmatched in every way, but they won anyway, not because they had better weapons, but because they were fighting for the right to determine their own fate. The president turned back to the ambassador and said that this was what humans were fighting for now, and if they lost, then they would lose as free people. She said that the Dominion would remember the cost of taking that freedom away. Felinora asked what would happen if humanity lost, and Torres replied that they would lose free, but they would make sure the Dominion never forgot the price. The diplomatic envoy departed Earth with no agreement reached, and as her ship left orbit, Felinora sent a private message to High Chancellor Morduin recommending maximum diplomatic effort to avoid war because these humans would not yield, and they would make any conflict extraordinarily costly. The Council's response came within hours, and it was a simple order to mobilize the battle fleet. Across human space, from Earth to Mars, to the asteroid colonies to Alpha Centauri, the call went out for total mobilization. Every military vessel was activated and defense platforms went live, and weapons factories shifted to maximum production. A woman named Amy Rogers, who was a shuttle pilot, received her mobilization notice in her small apartment on Mars. She had never seen combat and spent 10 years ferrying supplies between stations as a civilian contractor. But now she was being called to fight. Amy looked at the notice and then at a picture on her wall showing Earth rising over the lunar horizon. Her grandfather had been a soldier who fought in the resource wars, and he taught her that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything. She put on her flight suit and reported for duty. On Europa Station, a hydroponics engineer named Chris Bennett did the same thing. In the asteroid belt, a mining crew led by Sam Porter converted their industrial ship into a makeshift weapons platform. Across human space, millions of people who never wanted to be soldiers prepared to become exactly that, because the Dominion was bringing war, and humanity was going to show them what war really meant. Commander Vecthar watched reports coming in from his quarters on the Zorvian homeworld. The Dominion was mobilizing 2,000 warships and 500,000 soldiers with enough firepower to reduce a planet to rubble. Against them stood humanity with 3 million military personnel and 20 million trained reserves and 7 billion people who refused to surrender. Vecthar had seen many wars in his long life, and he knew how this would end. The question was not who would win, but what the victory would cost and whether either side would survive to enjoy it. The Dominion battle fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, with 2,000 warships arranged in perfect formation that stretched across space like a wall of steel and fire. Fleet Admiral Krondar stood on the bridge of his new flagship called the Celestial Sovereign and watched sensor displays light up with human defensive positions throughout the system. What he saw made his luminescent markings dim with worry, because the humans had turned their entire solar system into a fortress with weapons platforms hidden in the asteroid belt and fortified positions on every major moon and significant military presence around the gas giants. His tactical officer reported that sensors detected approximately 3,000 human vessels, but most were converted civilian craft and only 500 were true military warships. The numbers should have been comforting because the Dominion had superior technology and firepower. But Krondar had learned at Alpha Centauri not to trust numbers when dealing with humans. He ordered his communications officer to open a channel to the Human Defense Forces and the view screen activated, showing a woman in a dark blue uniform with admiral's insignia. Her name was Patricia Hayes, and her expression was calm, but showed no sign of backing down. Krondar offered one final chance for peaceful resolution and said that if the humans stood down their forces and acknowledged Dominion authority, then no shots needed to be fired. Admiral Hayes smiled, and it was the same kind of smile that Colonel Ward had given him before the Alpha Centauri disaster. She said her orders were simple and that Krondar had entered human sovereign space without authorization, and he had 1 hour to withdraw beyond the edge of the solar system. After that deadline, the humans would consider his presence an act of war and respond accordingly. The Dominion Admiral pointed out that his fleet outnumbered and outgunned the human forces, but Patricia replied by mentioning something about the British in 1770, 5 and the Germans in 1941. She said that every empire that ever faced humanity thought they would win easily, and the universe should have learned by now. The transmission ended, and Krondar ordered his fleet to advance in battle. Formation with all weapons systems active and shields at maximum. He told his officers to prepare for the worst because the humans would make them pay for every meter of space they took. The Dominion fleet moved forward, expecting the humans to fall back and use defensive tactics to preserve their smaller force. They were wrong, because the human fleet, led by Admiral Hayes in a ship called the Defiant, accelerated directly toward the Dominion formation. It was complete tactical insanity because the humans were charging straight into superior firepower and abandoning any advantage their defensive positions might have given them. Krondar's tactical officer said they were committing suicide, but the Admiral understood what the humans were doing. They were going to make this battle personal and brutal from the first moment. The two fleets met near Saturn with Titan's orange surface, providing a backdrop to the battle. The Dominion opened fire first, and energy beams and plasma torpedoes lanced across space. Human ships exploded as their shields were overwhelmed by superior firepower, but the humans kept coming without hesitation. The Defiant aimed directly for Krondar's flagship, even though it was a tenth the size of the Celestial Sovereign. Dominion cruisers moved to intercept, and their weapons tore into the Defiance. Hull and entire sections exploded, venting atmosphere and debris into space. Admiral Hayes never changed course, and the Defiant returned fire with railguns that used kinetic force instead of energy weapons. The solid projectiles punched through Dominion shields with impacts that energy weapons could not match. The damage control officer reported multiple hull breaches and heavy casualties, but Patricia ordered them to keep firing and divert all power to forward weapons. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Victor Nash pushed the reactor beyond safety limits, while alarms screamed warnings that he ignored. The ship shuddered as another Dom Enian salvo hit them, and Victor reported that they were breaking apart. Patricia told him to make them count before they went, and the Defiant closed to point-blank range with the Dominion battlecruiser. At that distance, shields meant nothing, and both ships poured fire into each other with weapons designed to kill from thousands of kilometers away, firing from meters apart. The Defiant died first when a plasma torpedo tore through its reactor, and the ship exploded in nuclear fire. But in its final moments, the railguns punched through the cruiser's hull in 17 places. The Dominion ship listed sideways, venting atmosphere with its weapon systems offline and drifting dead in space. Across the battlefield, the same pattern repeated again and again. Human ships charged into close range and traded their lives for Dominion vessels in exchanges that made no tactical sense. A converted mining hauler called the Prospector, crewed by asteroid miners, rammed a Dominion destroyer at full thrust, and both ships exploded in balls of fire. A converted passenger liner named Hope's Journey took fire from 3 Dominion warships, and her hull disintegrated under the barrage, but as she died, she launched every escape pod filled with explosives instead of people. The pods detonated against Dominion shields and overloaded them long enough for human fighters to exploit the gaps. Krondar watched human casualties mount, and his tactical officer called it madness, because they were sacrificing themselves for nothing. The admiral corrected him and said they were buying time, and he told his officer to look at the battlefield positioning. While the human fleet had charged forward their weapons, platforms in the asteroid belt and around the moons had been repositioning themselves. The Dominion fleet focused on the frontal assault had allowed themselves to be surrounded, and now they were trapped. Asteroid belt opened fire, and thousands of weapons platforms hidden among the rocks revealed themselves all at once. The Dominion rearguard, composed of support vessels and supply ships, was devastated in the opening volley. On Titan's surface, Colonel Danny Ward watched the battle from a military command center buried under the moon's ice. Beside him, Tactical Coordinator Helen Brooks called out targeting solutions to the defense platforms, and Danny ordered them to concentrate fire on Dominion support vessels to cut their supply lines. Dominion ships tried to turn and face the new threat, but that exposed them to human fighters that had been waiting in Titan's shadow. The fighters were small and fast and impossible to track, and they swarmed over Dominion destroyers like insects, targeting engines and weapon systems. Pilot Amy Rogers flew her fighter through the chaos with steady hands, despite never having been in combat before. She locked onto a Dominion destroyer's engine pod and fired her missiles, and they struck true. The engine exploded and sent the destroyer spinning out of control, and Amy whispered that this was for every human who would never see home again. The battle raged for 18 hours without pause. The Dominion's superior technology gave them advantages, but humans fought with a ferocity that could not be measured in statistics or tactical displays. When human ships were crippled, their crews set reactors to overload and aimed for the nearest Dominion vessel. When weapons ran dry, they used the ships themselves as weapons. When outgunned, they used Saturn's rings and Titan's atmosphere as cover and turned the terrain into an ally, Krondar finally ordered a full retreat when he realized that continuing the battle would cost him his entire fleet. The Dominion had lost 300 warships and over 50,000 personnel. Human casualties were even higher, with 800 ships destroyed and over 100,000 dead. But the Dominion fleet was retreating, and humanity still held Saturn. In the Titan Command Center, Danny Ward looked at casualty reports and felt the weight of every name. These were not just numbers, but people he had trained with and fought alongside and shared meals with, and each one had a family and dreams and a life cut short. Helen Brooks put a hand on his shoulder and said they had held their ground. Danny asked quietly what the cost was, and Helen replied that it was whatever it took, and he heard the same grief in her voice. Across the solar system, humanity mourned its dead and prepared for the next battle, because everyone knew the Dominion would return with more ships and more soldiers and more determination. Admiral Krondar sat in his quarters, composing a report to the council about losing 300 ships to a supposedly inferior enemy, and he knew they would demand explanations. He understood now what Vecthar had tried to warn them about, because the humans had not won through superior technology or brilliant tactics. They won because they were willing to pay any price to defend their home, and every human who died took Dominion soldiers with them. This was not war as the Dominion understood it, but extinction-level desperation turned into military strategy. Krondar ended his report with a recommendation: to negotiate peace immediately, because the humans could not be defeated by conventional warfare, and every battle would cost more than the Dominion could afford. The Battle of Titans sent shockwaves through every corner of the Dominion, and for the first time in 3 centuries, their military had been forced to retreat from an enemy fleet. High Chancellor Morduin called an emergency council session, and the chamber filled with tension so thick it could be cut with a blade. Councillor Threnix stood before anyone could speak and roared that losing 300 ships to primitives was unacceptable, and he demanded Fleet Admiral Krondar be removed from command, and that the Dominion deploy their entire core battle fleet to crush humanity once and for all. Commander Vecthar stepped forward with his scarred face showing the weight of centuries, and asked how many more ships they were willing to lose. He said the humans had just demonstrated they were willing to trade 10 of their ships for one Dominion vessel, and asked if the Dominion could sustain that ratio. Threnix started to say they had 10,000 warships, but Vecthar interrupted and said the humans had an entire species willing to die. He explained that every human, whether civilian or military, was a potential soldier, and they had turned their whole solar system into a fortress, and they were not fighting for territory or resources but for survival, which made them infinitely more dangerous than any enemy the Dominion had ever faced. The debate in the council chamber lasted for hours, with species that had allied with the Dominion for centuries suddenly questioning whether this war was worth the cost. Ambassador Felinora presented an analysis showing that humans had orbital manufacturing capabilities, and every day they were building more weapons and ships and platforms. She said that Dominion's supply lines stretched across light years, while human production was right there in their home system, and in a war of attrition, time favored humanity, not the Dominion. Threnix argued they were still technologically inferior, and one more major battle would break them, but Vecthar countered that the humans had fought wars lasting decades and conflicts that consumed entire generations, and they were prepared for a long war, but the Dominion was not. The vote was called, and the chamber fell completely silent as species cast their decisions. 22 voted for negotiation, and 18 voted for escalation, and for the first time since the war began, the peace faction had won. High Chancellor Morduin announced that the council would send another diplomatic envoy to Earth with full authorization to negotiate a peace treaty, and Ambassador Felinora would lead the delegation again. Threnix stormed from the chamber in fury, but the vote was final and could not be changed. 3 weeks later, Felinora returned to Earth, and this time she came with authority to offer real concessions. The new Geneva facility welcomed her, and President Ellen Torres greeted her with courtesy, but there was strength beneath the diplomacy. General Marcus Hill and Secretary Greg Palmer stood with her, along with military leaders who had fought at Titan and survived. The negotiations began, and both sides knew they wanted peace, but each fought for every advantage they could gain. Over the following days, they hammered out a framework for lasting peace. The Dominion agreed to recognize all current human territorial claims, including Alpha Centauri and the entire Sol system. They established a demilitarized zone between human and Min, Dominion space, and agreed to open trade negotiations for mutual benefit. In return, humanity agreed to limit military expansion for 10 years and to allow Dominion observers at their shipyards to verify compliance. The humans also agreed to compensate families of Dominion soldiers killed at Alpha Centauri and Titan, though Torres made it clear this was goodwill, not an admission of wrongdoing. The most difficult point was about authority, and Threnix's S faction had insisted that humanity acknowledge Dominion leadership in galactic affairs. General Hill said bluntly during one session that this was not happening, and they would recognize the Dominion as an equal political entity. He said humans would engage in diplomatic relations and trade and cultural exchange, but they would not acknowledge anyone's authority over humanity except humans themselves. Felinora had expected this because she had learned that independence was humanity's core value. She agreed to equal recognition, which established humanity as a sovereign power in their own right. On the final day of negotiations, as both sides prepared to sign the treaty, Felinora requested a private meeting with President Torres. They walked through gardens. Outside the diplomatic facility, with the Atlantic Ocean visible in the distance, Felinora's bioluminescent markings pulsed thoughtfully, and she said she had a question. She told Torres that throughout negotiations, the humans had been reasonable and diplomatic and willing to compromise, but during the war, their people fought with savagery that shocked the entire Dominion, and she asked how they reconciled these two aspects. Torres stopped walking and looked out at the ocean for a long moment. She said that humans were a contradictory species, capable of great cruelty and great kindness, often at the same time. She explained that humanity had fought wars that nearly destroyed their civilization, but they also created art and music and literature that celebrated life and peace. The president turned to face Felinora and said the truth was that humans preferred peace, and they would rather build than destroy and create rather than kill. But they had learned through thousands of years of history that sometimes the only way to secure peace was to make war so terrible that enemies never wanted to fight. Again, Felinora said softly that she meant the Battle of Titan, and Torres nodded. The president explained that humans did not want that battle, but once it started, they made sure the Dominion would remember it. She said they made sure every Dominion ship that returned carried stories of what humans were capable of when defending their homes, and it was the same strategy humanity used throughout their history. They made the cost of conquest higher than any potential gain and forced their enemies to choose between peace and destruction. The ambassador asked what would have happened if the Dominion had continued the war, and Torres's expression hardened. She said that humans would have fought until one side could not fight anymore, and they would have used weapons they hoped never to deploy again. Torres explained that they would have turned every planet and moon and asteroid into a weapon, and made sure that even if the Dominion conquered them, the victory would be so costly that the Dominion itself would collapse. Then she softened slightly and said she was glad it did not come to that because peace was always humanity's preference. The treaty was signed in a ceremony broadcast across both human and Dominion space. President Torres and High Chancellor Morduin stood together surrounded by representatives from both civilizations and formally ended the war. The celebrations on Earth were quiet because too many had died for there to be pure joy. In the Titan Command Center, Colonel Danny Ward and his team watched the ceremony in silence, surrounded by empty chairs that represented colleagues who would never see this moment. Helen Brooks asked if he thought the peace would last, and Danny said it depended on whether the Dominion remembered what the war cost them, because the moment they forgot there would be trouble again. On Mars, Amy Rogers stood at a memorial wall with her hand resting on a name carved in black stone. Lieutenant Jake Morrison had been killed at Titan when his fighter wing held the line against impossible odds, and he had been her instructor and friend, and someone she hoped might be more. Once the war ended, she whispered that they won, and humanity was free, and that was what he had fought for. Across human space, similar scenes played out with victory. Celebrations mixed with memorial services, because humanity had proven they could stand against a galactic empire. But the cost was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. In the Dominion, the reaction was complex, with some species celebrating peace and others viewing it as humiliation. Counselor Threnix resigned his position, unable to accept what he saw as surrender to primitives. But most Dominion species learned that military superiority did not guarantee victory, and that determination and sacrifice could overcome technological advantages. They learned that humanity was not a species to be underestimated or threatened lightly. Commander Vecthar stood in his quarters watching the treaty signing and felt vindication but no satisfaction. He had been right, but being right cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. His communication console showed a message from Admiral Krondar, thanking him because his warnings might have prevented the war if the Council had listened. Instead, they learned the hard way what Vecthar already knew, about humans being dangerous, not because they were strong, but because they refused to give up. 10 years passed, and the treaty held strong. Human space expanded cautiously, always respecting boundaries established in the peace agreement. Trade between humanity and the Dominion grew and brought prosperity to both civilizations. The demilitarized zone became a hub of cultural exchange where humans learned Dominion science and philosophy, while Dominion species studied human art and military. At a joint military academy on a neutral station, students from both civilizations trained together, including a woman named Lieutenant Rachel Torres, who was the former president's daughter, and a Zorvian officer named Subcommander Talvin, who was Vector's grandchild. They stood together, looking at a memorial listing the dead from both sides with human names and Dominion designations, carved side by side. Talvin said quietly that his grandfather claimed the war was inevitable because Council arrogance made it so, but perhaps it was necessary because sometimes species needed to fight before they could truly respect each other. Rachel nodded and said her mother had said something similar about humanity, needing to prove they could not be conquered before being treated as equals. The war was terrible, but it established who humans were in the galaxy. They stood in silence, honoring the dead who bought peace with their lives. Rachel said the question now was what they would do with the peace those people gave them. Talvin looked at her thoughtfully and said they would build something better and make sure the sacrifice meant something. They walked away from the memorial together as two young officers from species that had been at war. A decade ago now, working together to build a better future. Behind them, the memorial stood silent as a reminder of the price of arrogance and the cost of freedom, and a warning that humanity would fight to the last breath to defend their independence.